Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York on January 17, 1899. The son of Italian immigrants, Gabriele and Teresa Capone, young Al grew up in a working-class neighborhood filled with tenements, saloons, and gangs. His father was a barber, his mother a seamstress. They worked hard, dreaming that America would give their children opportunities they never had in Naples. But for Al, the streets became his true education. Brooklyn, at the turn of the century, was a place where survival depended on toughness. Ethnic gangs ruled the blocks, and kids learned early that fists, not schoolbooks, often decided one's future. Capone was intelligent but restless. He dropped out of school at age 14 after striking a teacher. From that moment on, the world of gangs and hustling became his classroom. He fell in with neighborhood toughs, joining small-time street gangs that would shape his destiny. One man in particular influenced him, Johnny Torrio, an older, sharper gangster who became a mentor. Torrio was not a reckless thug. He was a strategist. He believed crime should be run like a business, organized, efficient, and profitable. That philosophy would stick with Capone for life. By his late teens, Capone was working as a bouncer and bartender at the infamous Harvard Inn, a Coney Island bar owned by gangster Frankie Yale. It was here he earned his nickname. One night, after insulting a woman, Capone was slashed across the face with a knife by her brother. The scars left him with a permanent mark and the name that would follow him forever, Scarface. Capone hated the nickname. In later years, he would tilt his head away from cameras to hide the scars. But the streets remembered, and so did history. In Brooklyn, Al Capone was just another young thug trying to climb the ladder. But soon, a move to Chicago would change everything. In 1919, Al Capone followed his mentor, Johnny Torrio, to Chicago, a city pulsing with energy, corruption, and opportunity. Chicago wasn't just any city. It was the beating heart of America's Prohibition-era underworld. The 18th Amendment had just made the sale of alcohol illegal, but Americans weren't about to give up their whiskey, gin, and beer. Demand didn't vanish, it exploded. And where there was demand, men like Torrio and Capone supplied it. Prohibition was supposed to bring morality and order. Instead, it created a golden age for organized crime. Speakeasies, secret bars hidden behind false doors, basements, or soda shops popped up on every block. Bootleggers smuggled liquor from Canada, brewed it in hidden stills, and moved it in trucks guarded like military convoys. Capone started as Torrio's enforcer, muscle for the operation. He collected debts, protected shipments, and dealt with rivals the only way the streets knew, with violence. But unlike many gangsters, Capone had charm. He was polite, well-dressed, and knew how to talk to both criminals and businessmen. He could terrify with a glance and then buy you dinner the same night. By the early 1920s, Capone had become Torrio's most trusted lieutenant, and as Chicago erupted into gang wars over territories and bootlegging routes, Capone's reputation grew. He was ruthless when necessary, but he understood that fear alone wouldn't build an empire. To control Chicago, you needed politicians, police, judges, and the people themselves. Torrio taught him, violence is bad for business. Bribes are better than bullets. Capone listened, but when bullets were necessary, he made sure they were unforgettable. In 1925, everything changed. Torrio was ambushed by a rival gang, shot several times, and barely survived. He decided it was time to retire, handing the empire, Chicago's bootlegging business, gambling operations, and brothels, to his young protege. At just 26 years old, Al Capone became the boss of Chicago. And with him at the helm, the city was about to descend into an era of blood, jazz, and corruption unlike anything America had ever seen. Capone's Chicago was a city of contradictions. Wealth and brutality, glamour and terror, jazz and gunfire coexisted under his rule. He understood the importance of public image. While he orchestrated murders, he also donated to charities, opened soup kitchens, and mingled with reporters. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became his most infamous act. February 14, 1929, 7 members of the North Side Gang were executed in a Lincoln Park garage. Shotguns and Thompson submachine guns did the work. Capone never fired a gun that day, but the city knew the message. Capone ruled Chicago, and opposition meant death. Capone's empire was meticulously organized. Money flowed from breweries, distilleries, speakeasies, and gambling halls. Politicians and law enforcement officers were bribed. Newspapers covered him with a mix of awe and fear. Yet, his success drew unwanted attention. The federal government, including the fledgling FBI, began investigating. Agents tracked shipments, monitored finances, and collected evidence. Capone's days of unchecked power were numbered. Despite his public generosity, Capone's private life was complex. He entertained in lavish mansions, drove custom Cadillacs, and maintained a close circle of loyal men. But paranoia gnawed at him. Rival gangs, traitorous lieutenants, and federal agents were constant threats. In the coming years, it would not bullets, but the tax code that would bring Capone to his knees. By the early 1930s, Al Capone's empire was at its peak. Chicago was his playground, and the headlines were his stage. Speakeasies overflowed with patrons, jazz bands played in gilded clubs, and Capone's face graced newspapers with headlines both admiring and condemning him. But behind the glamour, trouble was brewing. Federal agents had been watching him for years. They knew Capone was untouchable by traditional law enforcement. Bribes flowed too easily. Witnesses disappeared or changed their stories. Guns and gang wars couldn't legally confine him. But there was one weapon Capone could not dodge: the tax code. Enter Elliot Ness, a young, determined Prohibition agent from Cleveland. He led a team of untouchables, men who refused bribes and intimidation. Their mission? Hit Capone where he was most vulnerable: his finances. Capone, as savvy as he was ruthless, had overlooked one thing. Every dollar of his empire left a paper trail. Ledgers, bank statements, invoices, and witnesses could all prove tax evasion. Ness and his team meticulously gathered evidence, tracking shipments, observing front businesses, and connecting financial dots. Meanwhile, Capone's personal life reflected his growing arrogance. He threw lavish parties at his Palm Island mansion, hosted famous entertainers, and drove around in bulletproof cars. Yet paranoia shadowed him. Every knock at the door, every police siren seemed like a harbinger of doom. On May 17, 1931, federal agents finally acted. Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The charge was almost laughable to the public: a man responsible for murder, smuggling, and corruption brought down by unpaid taxes? But this was legal genius at work. The law didn't need to tackle murder, it only needed to prove he had not paid what he owed. Capone fought back with everything he had. He tried to intimidate judges and jurors, bribe witnesses, and attempted to discredit federal agents. But the case was airtight. Detailed financial records, testimonies from accountants, and paper trails of illicit profits made escape impossible. The trial began in 1931. Newspapers followed every move. Crowds packed the streets outside the courthouse. Capone, once untouchable, now had to sit in the defendant's chair, facing the law he had long evaded. Despite his bravado, Capone's health was beginning to fail. Syphilis, contracted years earlier, was slowly eating away at his mind and body. Even in court, his sharpness was dulled, his temper fraying. Witnesses recounted the scale of his empire, the intimidation, and the violence, but it was the numbers, ledgers, and receipts that would seal his fate. Finally, in October 1931, Capone was convicted on 5 counts of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay back taxes. The empire he built with blood, booze, and fear began to crumble. Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary and later to Alcatraz Island, where the unbreakable rules of the prison system finally restrained the man who had once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. Al Capone entered prison as the most feared man in America, but the walls of Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary and later Alcatraz changed him. No bribes could sway guards, no threats could silence fellow inmates, and no wealth could buy freedom. For the first time in decades, Capone faced absolute control. Prison life was brutal. Cells were small, food plain, and routines rigid. Guards enforced discipline with iron fists, and any hint of favoritism could spark deadly fights among prisoners. Capone, once commanding an empire, was reduced to following orders, making beds, and waiting for meals. But the mental toll was even greater. Years of syphilis, left untreated during his rise to power, began to manifest more severely. Memory lapses, mood swings, and confusion eroded his sharp mind. The man who once outsmarted law enforcement now struggled to remember names and dates. Despite his decline, Capone remained a figure of fascination. The press documented his imprisonment with relentless interest, reporting on his behavior, his meals, and occasional privileges. He received letters from loyalists and former allies, reminding the public of his notorious influence. Inside Alcatraz, Capone's health deteriorated further. He lost weight, suffered from high blood pressure, and was plagued by recurring syphilitic symptoms affecting his nervous system. By the time he was released in 1939, after serving nearly 8 years, he was a shadow of his former self. His empire had crumbled, his allies had moved on, and Chicago's underworld had shifted to new hands. Al Capone died on January 25, 1947, in Miami, Florida, from complications related to syphilis. But his story lived on. He became the archetype of the American gangster. Charming, ruthless, charismatic, and ultimately human. Capone's life demonstrated the rise and fall cycle of power in the criminal underworld. His empire flourished because of public demand, systemic corruption, and his own ruthless intelligence. Yet it collapsed because no empire, however vast, can survive without accountability. The lessons of Capone's life remain clear. Power attracts scrutiny, violence carries consequences, and crime, no matter how sophisticated, eventually meets the law. His story continues to fascinate historians, filmmakers, and audiences, serving as a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by morality. The story of Al Capone is more than a tale of crime. It's a study of human nature, ambition, and society. From Brooklyn streets to Chicago's golden age of gangsters, Capone's journey reflects the duality of man, generosity and cruelty, charm and terror, brilliance and folly. For viewers today, Capone's life asks a question. What price do we pay for ambition and power? And how thin is the line between legend and infamy? Al Capone's name endures, not merely because of the crimes he committed, but because of the myth, the media, and the lessons his life teaches. Chicago remembers him, America remembers him, and the world remembers the rise and fall of one of history's most notorious gangsters.